In the basement of one of the most visited museums on Earth, sealed inside a wooden crate that hasn't been opened in over 40 years, sits an object that quietly contradicts everything you were taught about ancient history. It isn't lost. It isn't missing. It isn't waiting to be discovered by some lucky archaeologist digging in the desert. It's already been found. It's already been cataloged. And it's been deliberately kept away from your eyes, locked behind a door that even most museum employees don't have the clearance to open. Why would an institution built to educate the public go out of its way to bury the very thing people would travel across the world to see? That question is going to unravel a lot more than you expect, because what you're about to hear isn't a rumor pulled from some forgotten forum. It's documented. It's real. And once you understand the pattern, you'll never look at a museum the same way again. Most people walk through a museum and assume they're seeing the best of the best, the crown jewels of human history carefully selected and proudly displayed. But here's the number that almost nobody knows. The vast majority of what major museums actually own, in some cases more than 90% of their entire collection, never makes it to a public gallery. It sits in storage. Some of it sits there for decades. Some of it we now know sits there because someone decided, quietly and without explanation, that the public was better off not seeing it. That's not a display problem. That's a decision. And decisions like that always have a reason, even when the official paperwork says otherwise. Let's start with the first case because it's the one that got this whole investigation started. In the early 20th century, a joint archaeological expedition uncovered a set of artifacts inside a burial chamber that, according to the notes left behind by the excavation team, did not match anything else found at the site. The materials were wrong for the era. The craftsmanship was too advanced for the tools known to exist at that time and in that region. The lead archaeologist described the find in his personal journal as troubling and difficult to reconcile with the accepted timeline, language that almost never appears in official field notes, because scientists are trained to describe what they see, not what unsettles them. Within a year of that discovery, the objects were transferred to a museum on the other side of the world. They were never displayed. They were cataloged under a generic description that gave no hint of their significance, buried inside a filing system so vague that, for decades, almost nobody outside the museum's own archival staff knew the items existed at all. When researchers finally tracked down the transfer records nearly 70 years later, the official explanation on file was simple: pending further study. 70 years is a long time to still be pending. Here's where it gets more interesting, because this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern that repeats itself across different countries, different cultures, and different centuries of history, almost like the same institutional instinct kicks in every single time something doesn't fit the accepted narrative. Case 2 takes us to a different continent entirely, to a civilization whose written records were largely destroyed during a period of colonization, leaving historians to piece together their achievements from fragments, ruins, and whatever objects survived. In the 1960s, a set of intricately carved stone tablets was recovered from a site that, at the time, was believed to have been abandoned centuries earlier. The tablets contained a symbolic system that didn't match any known writing system from that culture, an alphabet, if you can call it that, unlike anything cataloged before or since. Instead of prompting a wave of research and public fascination, the tablets were quietly acquired by a museum, examined by a small internal team, and then removed from the research rotation entirely. A curator who worked at that institution decades later, speaking anonymously in an interview archived online, described being told directly that the tablets were not to be discussed outside the department. Not destroyed, not disputed as fake, just silenced. If they were fraudulent, there would be no need for secrecy, only debunking. The fact that the institution chose silence over explanation tells you almost everything you need to know about how uncomfortable that discovery actually was. Now, before this starts to sound like every museum on Earth is running a secret vault of world-shattering secrets, it's worth pausing to be honest about why this actually happens. Because the real explanation is almost more unsettling than the conspiracy version, precisely because it's true. A huge amount of what gets hidden away isn't hidden because it's dangerous or reality-bending. It's hidden because of legal ownership disputes that can drag on for generations, artifacts looted during colonial occupations that their country of origin is still actively fighting to reclaim, human remains that religious or indigenous communities have demanded be kept out of public display out of basic respect, and yes, sometimes simple bureaucratic neglect, where an object gets boxed up during a renovation in the 1970s, and nobody ever gets around to unpacking it again. These aren't excuses. They're documented, verifiable reasons, and in many cases, they are far more damning than any conspiracy theory, because they reveal something real about how institutions built on the idea of preserving human history have, for over a century, also been complicit in erasing it, hiding it, and, in the worst cases, outright stealing it from the very cultures who created it in the first place. That brings us to case 3, and this one connects those two threads, the strange and the institutional, more directly than almost any other example on record. During a major excavation in the early 20th century, an entire structure was uncovered that appeared to predate every known civilization believed to exist in that region by several thousand years. The engineering involved, precise stone cutting, structural techniques that wouldn't be formally understood again until millennia later, immediately drew comparisons to sites considered some of the greatest mysteries in archaeology. But instead of becoming a global sensation, the site was excavated quietly, documented in academic papers that never reached mainstream attention, and then deliberately reburied under sand and soil, officially to preserve the structural integrity of the find during a period when funding for long-term conservation simply didn't exist. That explanation isn't necessarily false. Conservation at that scale really was expensive and genuinely difficult in that era. But here's the detail that keeps this case alive in archaeological circles decades later. The exact coordinates of the site have never been re-released to independent researchers, and multiple requests for renewed excavation, some backed by universities with their own funding, have been quietly denied by the governing authority for reasons that, to this day, have never been made fully public. When an institution has both the funding and the outside interest to reopen an investigation and still says no, you have to ask what exactly they're protecting, the artifact, or the story that artifact might tell. There's a fourth thread worth pulling on here too, because it doesn't involve a single dramatic discovery. It involves an entire category of objects that most people don't even know exists. Every major museum maintains what's sometimes called a study collection, a section of the archive reserved not for public education, but for internal research, off limits to the general public by policy, not by accident. On paper, that sounds reasonable. Researchers need access to raw materials without the pressure of public interpretation hanging over every finding. But study collections have also become, over the decades, a convenient place to file away anything an institution doesn't want to explain. A textile technique too advanced for its supposed era. A metal alloy that shouldn't have been achievable with the tools available at the time it was made. A skeletal structure that doesn't match the expected timeline of human migration into a region. None of these things are necessarily proof of some hidden alternate history. Most of the time, further study reveals a mundane explanation, a misdated layer of soil, a later burial disturbing an older site, a simple cataloging error from 100 years ago. But mundane explanations take time, funding, and staff who are willing to prioritize an inconvenient object over 100 other, more straightforward projects. So instead of getting answered, these objects get shelved, not because someone is actively hiding a secret, but because nobody in the building has the incentive to be the one who reopens a question that could take a decade and a career's worth of controversy to resolve. The tragedy isn't that there's a conspiracy. The tragedy is that curiosity has an expiration date inside institutions built to preserve it. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it changes the way you should think about every case that comes after it. This isn't a story about evil archivists twirling their mustaches in a candlelit basement. It's a story about how bureaucracies, even ones with the noblest founding mission imaginable, default to inertia. Doing nothing is always the path of least resistance. Reopening a 70-year-old case means admitting the institution sat on something important. Reclassifying an object means paperwork, funding requests, possibly a public relations situation. Nobody in the building wants to deal with this fiscal year. So the object stays exactly where it's been for decades. Quiet, boxed, and technically, if you ask the right question to the right department, still accessible. Just not to you. Not without a research request, a university affiliation, and months of waiting for approval that may or may not ever come through. So what do these three cases actually have in common, beyond the obvious fact that they all involve something buried, boxed, or quietly reburied? It's the pattern underneath the pattern. In every single case, the discovery challenged an accepted timeline, whether that timeline was about technology, language, or the very origins of a civilization. And in every single case, the institutional response wasn't to investigate louder, it was to go quiet, not destroy the evidence, which would be far more suspicious and far riskier legally. Just remove it from conversation, let it sit in a drawer, a crate, a sealed chamber until enough time passes that the people who originally cared have moved on, retired, or passed away, and the discovery becomes a footnote instead of a headline. It's not a dramatic cover-up with men in suits erasing files in the middle of the night. It's something quieter and, honestly, more believable. Institutional inertia weaponized as silence, where the easiest way to make an inconvenient truth disappear is to simply never talk about it again. And that raises the question this entire video has been building toward. If 3 documented cases look like this, cases that took years of digging through archival records, personal journals, and leaked internal interviews just to piece together, how many more are sitting in basements and storage vaults right now that we don't know about yet? Museums worldwide are estimated to hold hundreds of millions of cataloged objects. If even a tiny fraction of that number finds that challenge what we think we know, The amount of hidden history sitting just a few floors beneath the exhibits you've actually walked through is almost impossible to comprehend. Every glass case you've ever stood in front of, admiring a pot, a coin, a fragment of pottery from 3,000 years ago, was surrounded by rooms you never got to enter, filled with objects somebody decided you didn't need to see. There's one more layer to this worth mentioning before we come back to where we started, and it's the layer that turns this from a curiosity into something with real stakes. When artifacts vanish into storage without explanation, it isn't just historians who lose out. It's entire cultures whose descendants are still alive today, still asking their own governments and the museums that hold their ancestors' belongings for answers that never come. Repatriation requests, formal legal demands from countries asking for their own history back, have, in many documented cases, sat unanswered for decades, tied up in ownership disputes that conveniently never seem to resolve. Every year that an object stays buried in a storage vault instead of returned to the people it actually belongs to, or at the very least studied and explained, is another year that a piece of someone's identity stays locked behind an institutional door they don't have the key to. That's not a mystery for entertainment. That's an ongoing injustice hiding in plain sight, and it's arguably the most important reason to keep asking these questions in the first place. Not sensationalism, but simple accountability. Which brings us back to where we started, to that crate in that basement, sealed for over 40 years. Now that you understand the pattern, that first artifact doesn't sound like an isolated mystery anymore. It sounds like case number 4, following the exact same script as the 3 before it. Discovered, documented as troubling, but quietly removed from the public eye, and buried under an explanation just plausible enough that nobody thought to push back. Maybe it really is pending further study, or maybe, like almost everything else on this list, it's pending the moment enough people finally start asking the right questions, loud enough that silence stops being an option. So, here's the question worth sitting with after this video ends. If museums are willing to hide artifacts that complicate the story we've been told about our own past, what does that say about the story we've actually been given, the one on the plaques, in the textbooks, in the exhibits we walk through without a second thought? History isn't just what got written down, it's also what got left out, boxed up, and quietly filed away under pending. The real mystery was never whether these objects exist. It's how many of them are still down there, waiting for someone to finally ask why. Which one of these do you think is still sitting in a basement somewhere, waiting to be talked about? Let me know in the comments, because the next case I'm covering might just be the one museums have worked hardest to keep buried. If this kind of story is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night wondering what else has been quietly filed away and forgotten, you already know what to do before you go. There's a lot more sitting in the archives than anyone's willing to admit, and we're only just getting started digging through it.